Welcome to the award-winning Women in Healthcare Leadership podcast series brought to you by Medscape Education. Our mission is to educate, advocate, and inspire women in healthcare to lift as they rise. Each episode brings you voices of leaders who are breaking barriers and leading the way in advancing women's health. Join our global community of listeners as we hear from her. Ready to be part of the movement? Let's dive in.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Hear From Her Women in Healthcare Leadership podcast. I'm Jennifer Baumberger, Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships from Medscape Education, and I'm thrilled to be talking with two amazing women leaders that I just met in the rare disease space. I have the privilege today of introducing you to Dr. Hilary Longhurst. Hilary, would you like to give a quick intro as to your background and who you are?
Sure. I'm a physician. I lived and worked in London for many years and I trained in the UK. And in my youth, I did a PhD, and that completely changed the way I think about medicine and how I approach my patients. But actually, my inspiration doesn't come from the science, it really comes from the patients and the people who've got problems that can't be solved by the protocols and the guidelines that we currently use. So, although I've been employed throughout my whole life as a physician and I've never had an academic or scientific job, actually, when I see someone whose needs are not served, I need to go further. And that's why I've got into the science and I've linked up with amazing people like Mrinal, and we've taken things a bit further. And do you know what? When we want to go beyond and we try hard, it works. And we actually push the whole specialty forward, and that's really exciting. So now I'm in New Zealand. I've been working here for 5 years, and it's been great.
We're so thrilled to have you, and thank you for bringing Renal to our attention. We're very excited to have her on the podcast. I want to introduce you to Mrinal Shah. I'm going to let her introduce herself today, and we're going to have an exciting conversation about rare disease, HAE, and gene editing.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for the invitation to join you today. I'm Mrinal Shah. I am a director, clinical scientist working in clinical development at Intellia Therapeutics. And Intellia is a gene editing company where we're developing gene editing therapies to treat a number of rare diseases, which I think we're going to talk more about on this episode. My background is actually as a cancer biologist. I'm a PhD trained cancer biologist. And until I started working at Intellia about 3 years ago, I honestly didn't know much about rare disease. I didn't know much about hereditary angioedema, which I know we're going to talk about as well. My entire career and educational training had been in oncology. So it really took a turn, but it has been fantastic. And I've been learning so much, and it's been a privilege and an honor to work with people like Hilary on our program and the things that we're developing at Intellia.
Thank you. We're really excited to speak with you both. Let's start with the why. So, Hilary, what drew you to focus on HAE, especially rare disease care, where so many patients go unheard?
So I'd been in general medicine and I'd moved over to clinical immunology, which is a little bit more focused. And one day a patient came to see us who had hereditary angioedema, which I had never heard of. It's a rare disease. And we had the consultation. I looked it up, as you do. And she actually came back later. She made an appointment to see me and my boss. And she said that she was looking for a physician to take on the cause of hereditary angioedema. And she asked if we would do it. And my boss turned to me and said, "Yes, Hilary will do it." And the patient said, "It'll be easy." And I thought, yes, it'll be easy. Looks like a very straightforward disease. And that was 25 years ago, and we're still working on it, but we have made huge progress. And as is so often, I heard it first from the patient, and this woman had she was the first person to give herself C1 inhibitor intravenously, which is the protein that's missing in hereditary angioedema, and she felt that she had a solution for herself and her family but she wanted everyone else to have a solution. So together, me and this patient, we started the UK Hereditary Angioedema Association, and then we moved international. And I have to say that I was pretty focused on my day job, but every month or so she would pop up and very politely ask me to do stuff, and it really went from there. We A couple of times we've thought we've solved it, but actually there's always another dimension, and there's always another, improvement that you can make.
That's what's so interesting about rare disease, I find, is there's no one case is ever exactly the same, and there's always more you can be doing and other things that come up. Ronal, let's start with your why. So, what drew you into rare disease, especially from oncology? And is there anything specific that kind of drew you to rare disease care and then to focus on HAEs?
Yeah, so in my case, it's very different from Hillary's, obviously, working in industry, at least, sort of that initial working in industry. But for me, the opportunity to work in this space really coincided with the opportunity to work at Intelia. And so, it was sort of two things and multiple things dovetailing together in terms of my own professional trajectory, moving from oncology and actually moving into clinical development. Up until when I joined Intelia, I was working in medical publications in oncology. So I originally joined industry as a medical writer in oncology and spent a lot of time in pubs, eventually leading a large cross-functional team for a hematology oncology asset that covered multiple indications, and we did publication strategy. So very sort of interdisciplinary work. And at that time, I supported indications that were not yet approved. I obviously worked very closely with a lot of different functions in industry, especially clinical development. And given my own background and just the relationships that I had developed, I had always thought, oh, I would really like to go into that area. I could see myself doing this job. And really, just the opportunity came up when I was looking to sort of pivot my own career, and, try to move into development, given, my skill set and my background. I thought it was a really good fit. And so the opportunity came to join Intelia, which was a totally different kind of company than where I had been working before. I was working at a much larger pharma company. Intelia is much smaller, but really doing like incredibly novel science in rare disease. And so that was really how I ended up here. It wasn't necessarily intentional in terms of like, oh, I would really like to focus on this area. It was just sort of a confluence of events that led me here. Um, and it's been fascinating. Like I said, I've really been learning so much. And, my time in oncology, like I said, I had a very long period, in my own education and training, and then, professional time where I was like, oh, this is really going to be hard to leave this. I'm so embedded in this community. I really enjoy it. But working in hereditary angioedema has been just as rewarding, if not more so.
Yeah, thank you. Is there something with this journey and this transition into rare diseases? Is there something that really stuck out to you, like a patient story that really stayed with you? I know it can be like very inspiring. Oncology is also very inspiring too, but going from that to rare disease and kind of seeing what goes on there, is there anything, someone's voice that helped shape what you think about HAE or treatment innovation, anything that sticks out?
I think there've been many. I think HAE, as is so often the case, is an invisible disorder because when the patient comes to see you, they're fine. HA is a condition where you swell up in any part of your body, including internally, which is incredibly painful and disabling, or the throat, which can kill you. And a lot of my patients carry a very heavy psychological burden because relatives have died. So the families often feel that this is a curse on the family, and often it's not talked about outside the family, and sometimes not even inside the family, because conventional treatments for angioedema, for swelling, don't work. So they traditionally have not had much help from medical services. And they also have fatigue. And the really interesting thing that I've only come to realize recently is that it is about this fatigue, because for people with HAE, it is normal to be just working in a way that we would consider below par. And it's only when you get a treatment that will reverse the problem that people realize what the new normal is. And that's fascinating. And it plays with my mind a bit, because you think, well, am I normal? Are they normal? What is normal? You know? But it's wonderful to see. I'm just thinking particularly of a woman who I actually met in New Zealand, who uh, she gave me permission to tell her story at another interview. So I looked into her old notes, and I was actually ashamed at how we, the medics, had treated her in the past. So this woman had had she'd never been able to follow proper education. She'd not held down She was in her 40s, she'd not held down a job since she was in her teens because of her severe, frequent angioedema attacks made it impossible to work, and she was disbelieved. So there were episodes where she'd gone into the emergency room, the correct treatment was known, but it was felt that it wasn't worth giving it to her because it's an expensive treatment. She'd had horrible iatrogenic complications. She used a lot of opioid analgesia and then was blamed for using it. And there was suspicion that she might, if we tried to train her to give herself intravenous treatments, that she might use it recreationally. And there was no basis for this explanation. And in fact, with this woman, she wasn't an easy patient, and she didn't appear grateful. So we doctors like gratitude, but she didn't appear grateful. She had quite a flat affect, which I think is a reflection of what her life had been. But I decided we needed to take this problem on. She wasn't suitable for any trials because of her medical issues. Um, so Um, we trained her to administer C1 inhibitor to start with, and then we worked to get a better solution. And she actually had all sorts of challenges and complications that I can't explain to you for confidentiality reasons. And actually, in the end, she came through. She got a job after 30 years of unemployment. And it turns out she's a really hard worker. So she often doesn't come and see me because she's needed at work. She's been promoted. She has no qualifications, but she takes on responsibility. And it's just, I think with her, it's amazing to see what has been achieved. But my heart bleeds for her, because what might have been that she can never get back. And she tells me, well, she doesn't tell me anything, but her what's happened to her tells me that actually we need to do better for the future. We need to start earlier and prevent all this stuff happening. And we have the tools to do that now with our wonderful approaches. We just need the hearts and minds and the politics, and to get these treatments to everyone who might need it.
Yep, that's lovely. And that draws us back to Mrinal. In your work, how do you ensure that the patient voice is taken into account, a story like that one, and not just lab data when you're working to build your technologies?
Yeah, this is something that we actually think about and talk about a lot at Intellia, and I'm sure we're not alone. Plenty of other companies are doing the same. But you're exactly right. That the patient voice and the patient experience is really important in general, and especially when you're participating in a clinical trial. And so, what we have done in the course of development of our program and our trials is really try to incorporate that as much as we can. And so, the way that we do that is by conducting ad boards that are that involve patients. We attend patient focused congresses, patient meetings. We work with different advocacy groups, and all of this is done in service to you know um, hear directly from patients, to hear what they think about their own disease. How do they manage it in real life? The guidelines can say one thing, but what is happening in practice? What are their concerns about their own, daily living? How does their disease affect them, in the past, in the present day, things that they may have concerns about in the future. And we really do try to incorporate that feedback as much as we can. Of course, there are, you know, um, requirements that you can't get around in a clinical trial. But how can we make a protocol and the process that a patient has to go through if they opt to join our study as patient friendly as possible? What can we try to do to minimize the burden on the patient? Whether it's fewer blood draws or having telehealth visits or, having an app that they can use on their phone that's hopefully intuitive. Those are all things that we really try to think about to incorporate the patient experience in order to, hopefully in the future, improve outcomes for everybody.
I like the way that Intelia is thinking about this. I know we hope that every organization is taking that into account, but I don't know that that's always the case. So it's lovely to hear the creativity and innovation that you all are incorporating. Hilary, as you've worked on these newer innovations and kind of moved through your clinical care system, is your perspective on innovation evolved as you've kind of done this and moved into new parts of your career and new different opportunities?
Yes, it has over the years, and I will say that a lot of it's a human thing that you want to be safe and that you don't want to cause harm, and also you don't want to cause harm to yourself. So it's very tempting as a physician to sit in your comfortable space, abide by the guidelines, but when you work in rare diseases, sometimes you can see that you've got a patient, you're working to the guidelines, but you can see that the trajectory for that patient and their future is not good. And you need to step outside and do something differently. So you need to be brave. And whether that is working with the patient on an individual solution, which may be, as with the woman I talked to you about before, a little unconventional to start with, um, or whether it's thinking about the bigger picture and just thinking, how can we take the specialty forward? How can we do better for future patients? It depends on the exact situation. But for me, I think when you're outside medicine, it's quite common to the pharma companies don't have a great press. They're seen as big, bad corporate organizations. And actually, that's not the case. Obviously, there are good ones and bad ones, but in the vast majority of pharma companies are full of intelligent, amazing, creative, inspirational people who've gone into that sort of thing, I would say, because they want to make a difference. And as a physician working in rare diseases with people who don't have good solutions, it's my dream to get a pharma company interested in my speciality and to get them to work on it, and that's happened with hereditary angioedema, HAE. Um, and I think that's happened because there's physicians like me, there's patients like the ladies I spoke to who are willing to step up and ask for more. And this is a big issue because often people don't know when they're badly off. So they're willing to organise and ask for more. And then there's pharma companies like Intelia who actually are doing commercially high risk work, I would say, because a lot of companies that were working on really cutting edge, innovative things, the things that we really, really need, a lot of them don't make it. So we we need to work together because that's so inspirational and so powerful. But we also need ways where we can nurture um, our people and we can nurture our companies and the ways that we as human beings push things forward. So there has to be money involved, there has to be profit involved. But I think we do need to think about new ways of allowing people to develop stuff and to make their money, which I wholeheartedly um, approve of, but also ways of delivering these innovations to the world. And I don't know how we square that, but I think we need to just or politicians need to start thinking about how we do that.
Yeah, and I think that I know that these large companies and large systems can often be risk averse or slow to change. And one of the questions we had is, and I'll pitch it over to Renal, is how do you protect that curiosity and creativity you had? I know that you had just said like Intellia was the draw. You weren't necessarily looking to move on from oncology per se. So as you move through your career, what about Intellia or what about the creativity or what made you curious to kind of want to explore this new opportunity?
Yeah, I think it can be hard, right, to try and protect your curiosity and your creativity, like you said, in lots of different ways. So I think part of that is just recognizing sometimes that challenges that you may be encountering professionally can't dampen your spirit as a whole, right? You have to be able to sort of protect that, um, and draw some lines around that. Um, but I think really just being open, as much of that may sound like a cliche, it's really the key because, you know, that's the only way that things are going to move forward. Like Hilary was saying, being open to the idea of a partnership, maybe for somebody who's a clinician and working with pharma if they never have before, because at least that's the way that I think about it, right? We can't do the work that we do without the partnership of physicians like Hilary, without the partnership of patients, without the partnership of healthcare systems ultimately. So that is one thing. I think just being open, being thoughtful, asking questions. You know, Sometimes the question that you might have, you may be afraid to ask. I've certainly been in this position many times, and you're like, everybody else must know the answer to this. But when you finally ask it, somebody inevitably will be like, "Oh, I'm so glad you asked because I didn't know what the answer was either." Um, so I think just being willing and being open is really important, just in general, professionally, of course, in other areas of your life. But it does require some work sometimes just to get over that hump.
I have exactly that, asking that there's no question is stupid. You're meant to be the expert and you're asking this question,
Right.
otherwise you'll remain ignorant forever.
That's lovely. And now it's here from her. So I'm going to pitch it into as women leading innovation in your fields. Hillary, have there been moments when you felt like your voice or your vision was challenged or you were underestimated? And how did you handle that?
Oh, many. So, um, I think as a woman, you've got lots of competing interests. As a human being, you've got lots of competing interests in your life, but so much more so as a woman, and so much more so maybe as a woman of my generation. I do hope, and I think that things are improving, but we've got a way to go. So my life, my career has always been slightly unexpected. Um, I think you have to take your opportunities. So when I look at people today trying to get into medical school, you you apparently or trying to get into a particular specialty job, you apparently have to have had this passion for that particular thing your whole life. And my career's not been like that. It's been, well, I need a job. What is there out there? Oh, what's immunology? Oh, that looks as if it might be interesting. And then you go there and you make it your own. And, you know, if that's not happening, then I guess you'd move to something else. So I don't think, I think you have to have a passion, but I don't think you have to necessarily have your life planned out because it won't work like that. There'll be challenges in your way, and you just have to go round them or take another path. And actually, it's all valuable and it's all good. And if you want to contribute, you will still be able to do that. And I think the other thing is that many times in my life, well, there's two things. I've been afraid. So I'm terrified of harming patients. But what I've learned is that actually, when I look back, the times of my palm patients have largely been sins of omission, where I've not done something that I was scared to do, or someone has told me that actually they've put me down and they've told me that they know better. And even though in my heart I knew that was wrong, I've allowed that to happen. So I think you do have to be brave in representing your patient. There have been times when I've felt pressure. I've felt sort of corporate pressure from my employers to act in a way that I don't feel was right, and that I've been afraid that I would get into trouble or be blamed for that. And when I think about that sort of situation, each time I've thought, what's the worst thing that could happen? And the worst thing that could happen is not losing my job or even being struck off as a doctor. The worst thing that could happen is to become one of those people who doesn't do what's right and doesn't abide by the values that we would all we would all like to have. And actually, when you work like that, it's always okay. It may be difficult, but it's always okay. And then I guess the other thing is on the opportunistic front, it's being able to work even as a physician with no pharmaceutical experience. And I'm really not a corporate person, as Mrinal will say, but actually to work with big companies and medium-sized companies who've got a different view and a different expertise. We have so much common ground, and our overarching aim is similar. You know, Intelia and other companies are making amazing medications which are well tolerated, and they're just changing lives of my patients. And, you know, they want to sell them to my patients. I want my patients to have them. And we on my own, or the patient association on its own, we can't do that. The company on its own can't do that, but together we can make the impossible happen, and I've seen the impossible happen several times in my career, I really have.
That's wonderful. I've thought about that a lot. And I think that when it comes to these new innovations and pairing doing no harm with treating patients properly, with innovating responsibly, what does it really mean to either of you, to both of you, when you're thinking about the term innovation, especially when it comes to rare disease? What does innovate responsibly mean? And I know you've already kind of spoken about that a little bit. How do you incorporate that into what you're
You have to keep your feet on the ground, and you have to keep the common sense rule. There is sometimes I look at other people, they've gone off piste and they've gone, so you have to just say, actually, what does the evidence say? But evidence is not just double-blind placebo-controlled trials. What does the biological rationale say? It's like, you know, would I recommend this for my child or my sister or myself? Is it, are we acting sensibly here? We might be taking a risk, but, what's the worst that could happen? What's the worst that could happen if we don't go here? And so there's a huge common sense requirement, I would say.
and Mrinal, in pairing your background as a researcher, as a clinical researcher in oncology, and then moving into pharma, into industry, and then now into rare disease, is there anything else you want to talk about when it comes in when you're thinking about innovation, when you're thinking about building these new therapies or treatments?
Really, the question is, what does it mean to innovate responsibly? And I think that for when I think about it for myself, maybe on behalf of Intelia, like as a bigger entity, right? Like, what does that mean? I think a huge part of that is transparency, right? if you're trying to do something very novel for the first time, it can only behoove you to share information, right? As much information as possible. Because if you are able to share information, you build trust, right, with all of the stakeholders that may be involved that we've been talking about through the course of this conversation. And of course, this takes time, right? It takes time to build trust and for people to recognize you as potentially a leader in a space, as somebody who's going to be a responsible steward of the technology that they're developing. But I really think that transparency is a huge part of that, in terms of the responsibility. And of course, there are going to be risks with any type of new therapy. That's across the board, right? It doesn't matter what kind of therapy it is. And so, it's just keeping that in mind. Like Hilary was sort of saying, sort of, keeping that end goal in mind, um, keeping your feet on the ground, and just, thinking about, does this make sense from a scientific and medical perspective? Um, you know, is this something we should be doing? Um, can we sustain this? And really just trying to be transparent and to share data as it's available, to keep people informed, and to keep, I think, the patient top of mind, right? We're doing this in the hopes of, improving outcomes for people's lives, right? That's no small thing. So I think that's incredibly important as well.
Yeah, thank you. As you started moving through your career and through your clinical career, through your research career, Hilary, what first sparked your interest in gene editing, or CRISPR technology?
So, I remember in the early 2000s, I'm interested in immune deficiencies. So, um, Great Ormond Street, which was a sister hospital sort of next to us, was actually doing some of the first gene therapy trials, which were basically saving children's lives. And that was very exciting, but just seemed very remote. But as time went on and techniques have got more sophisticated, it's become clear that there's just huge, huge potential. And this has taken sort of 25 years, and we're only just at the start. But it seems to me that gene editing can go places that other treatments can't go, and with um, it can do it more safely. And I think gene editing or gene therapy is not just for rare diseases, but what it does do is it is a way that actually relatively cheaply we could correct problems that are there. And it may be that we're correcting a problem just in one part of the body, but it's a treatment that we could give, it's a one-off treatment, and that particular problem is solved, and then we could then treat another part of the body. So, for example, many of the disorders I treat are multi-system. So it's not just your blood, it's not just your liver, it's every bit of the body. And what so often happens is one organ it becomes critical. That person can have a transplant, so they can have a liver transplant or a bone marrow transplant. But then what happens is the very process of that transplant um, actually puts stress on the rest of the body. So a couple of years down the line, another part of the body will start to fail. And almost always that person is not well enough to have that second transplant, even if we did have the organs and the resources and everything. Actually, gene editing would can be given to, people who are not fit and not well, and there's no restriction, potential in theory. So it seems to me that we've got huge potential to actually keep our people healthier and contributing, and we don't have to wait till they're nearly dead to do it. We're going to be able to do it early. And I think I know there's a lot of lot of concern about immigration, but I think actually every single westernized nation is short of people and short of people who are well and out there and working. And so we need to really look at people with rare and common diseases and just say, what can we do medically to support people, to keep people contributing to society in the way we want? And I do think that gene editing is going to be a huge, big new tool to do that. And, you know, we should dream because it's only through our dreams that we can begin to map out what's possible and do it. And I think that's the big thing. We have to take those steps and move forward.
So it sounds like you I mean, it's really interesting that you worked and I forget what hospital it was, but near the hospital that kind of started some of this research, years ago. Was there a moment, and it sounds like there's been many of them, but for either of you in your career where you're like, "Oh, this actually could change the trajectory of everything." Was there, like, one patient or one case that really kind of hit you where you're like, "This is a huge benefit?"
So the hospital that was doing the gene therapy was Great Ormond Street Hospital, and I was working at St Bartholomew's, which took adult patients largely. So it wasn't the same hospital. But actually, it's only been recently with my work with Intellia that I've begun to see that it's not just for very sick, very rare people. I think that potentially gene therapy and gene editing, the techniques we've got now are going to be, an option for a huge, variety of people. So I would say with this trial that I've been doing with hereditary angioedema, which has effectively been curing the symptoms of this really very debilitating and damaging disorder, that I've come to see where it could go and come to understand scientifically what is now possible and what's going to be possible in the future, more to the point.
And Renal, any comments from you? Same.
Sure. I mean, I think, in contrast to Hillary, where I can't really point to a specific patient or, maybe even a specific event, for me, it's more of the slow accumulation um, over time, over my time at Intellia, where I have sort of seen like, oh, this is actually happening, right? Look, when I joined the company 3 years ago, I joined still quite early on in development. So we were still dosing patients in our phase 1 trial, which Hilary has been a part of since the beginning. And so it's really been seeing the evolution of our program over time. I remember this was in 2022, the first time that we were presenting data at a fairly big congress, which was here in the US. It was in the fall of that year. We were presenting data on our first 10 patients in our phase 1 trial. So that was our first in human trial. And we didn't even have any preliminary efficacy about all of those patients yet. And I remember reaching out, just cold emailing so many people that we were interested in talking to who are experts in the field, saying, we're from Intellia, this is what we're doing. We're going to be presenting data. We'd like to meet with you just to chat, and no one knew us. And so, since that time, like I was talking before about, sort of the idea of being transparent and sharing data, we've had the opportunity to continue to present data on our program, to show people how patients in our trials have been doing with this one-time treatment. And, slowly people start to know who we are, going to meetings, just, constantly reaching out to people, presenting more and more data. People see it and I think data is very convincing. I think in the end, especially for people who may be doubtful of something that's very novel and new, they're like, oh, is this really going to work? And we've had conversations with people over time who maybe initially we met with them and they were kind of lukewarm or, maybe in some cases like mildly dismissive of what we were doing. And since then, in the 3 years since, we've had conversations with those people again, and they've even said, like, I've talked to other people who've been involved with your trial. I've talked to Hilary or I've talked to so and so. And I've been looking at your data and I was wrong. I'm more convinced now. So certainly, I think just seeing that evolve, um, you know, outside the company, within the company, in terms of, how we progress the program. Now we have a phase 3 trial enrolling. It's like a one spark that turns into a fire. And so for me, like you said, it wasn't an aha moment, more a culmination of many moments that have led us to where we are now.
So you talked about some hesitations of some of the people that you had originally approached with this idea or talked to. What are those common misconceptions, and either of you can answer this, that people have about gene editing still?
So I think, the important thing to remember is that, there are going to be misconceptions about, especially in this day and age, many topics. But really, I think the thing to focus on is not so much what are the misconceptions specifically, but how can we address them and how can we better educate people?
Thank you. Exactly.
And so, from that perspective, I think that's something again that we think about all the time, that we are actively working on. And sometimes, like I was saying, it ends up being something that maybe we as Intellia are not necessarily doing. It's just other people going out and talking to their peers. There's a huge amount of value in that, whether it's HCPs talking to other HCPs, patients talking to other patients. I think the education part is really just key because with something novel and new, it's totally understandable to have questions or to have concerns. But, what can we do in order to combat that? How can we tailor our education for all of these different groups, all of these different audiences to address the questions that they have and make them feel confident in our data, in our plans, in all of that, in order to really just optimize outcomes for patients in the end. So yeah, it's not so much about the specifics, but education in general, I think is a huge component of that.
And I'd say that if you're a human being who's got a medical problem, your risk benefit is very different from the authorities and from the ethics people and the people who do the oversight. So actually, I've worked with several ethnic minorities and groups here who wouldn't normally accept genetic therapies, but actually, it's not been a problem. And people are very open to genetic treatments for medical use, I find, which was a surprise. It was not what I expected. I have to say that we are polluting the world and we've got a huge, big problem. So, what I do see is that people are much more hesitant, counterintuitively, about genetic tools, I guess, for agriculture and for addressing that sort of problem. And I think that's something that we need to think about, and we really do need to educate the public about more. And we do need to think about how we can use these tools really to solve some of our pollution problems, but in a responsible and safe way. So for me, that's actually the big frontier with genetic treatments, along with, of course, getting these treatments to people who need them and getting new pathways to develop individualized treatments for those very rare diseases where there may be 2 people in New Zealand who've got I'm thinking of some more patients now who've got a particular disease that it would be great to have a genetic therapy for them, and scientifically, it would be relatively straightforward, but it's just we need the mechanism to develop and deliver that without having to spend the millions and millions on, the regulatory things, and I think that's something that everyone's thinking about. So hopefully, the future is bright.
Yeah, so that's how you see the future of gene editing evolving. As I mean, it sounds like it's not could be applicable to curative therapies, but also kind of more as the question said, more long-term modulation approaches and even other things environmentally or whatnot that are problems right now. Is there any other way that this can involve, any other things that you think this could be helpful for?
It seems to me we'll be able to cut genes out, we'll be able to repair them, we'll be able to insert a gene that's missing, we'll be able to silence a gene reversibly. Um, you know, people like Intelia are working on delivery systems, so we'll be able to correct a problem in the brain or in the liver or in the blood or, hopefully in the lung in future. So I do see a huge potential, not just for us in affluent countries, but for I have a big collaboration with India, and your heart breaks when you see the need there. But of course, India has huge scientific skill. It has a lot of very educated people. So this sort of technique will completely change, maybe in 10 years, 15 years, will completely change what can be offered to people with rare diseases there, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I would just say, um, in terms of, where are we heading, right? I mean, the therapies that we're developing at Intellia are still investigational, right, at this time. Given my own role, do I think that we're on the cusp of one-time therapies? I would say yes. I think, data have been very positive and encouraging to date, so as Hilary said, I think the future is bright as well. But ultimately, with many of these diseases like we've been talking about, they present their own unique challenges. The experience of every patient who has that disease is also going to be different. But I think these types of therapies, CRISPR-based therapies, other types of tools in the gene editing space really have the potential to change how diseases are treated because they're going to be able to address these underlying mechanisms in different ways. As Hilary was alluding to, are we going to be able to target different organs? How are we going to do that? Are there going to be different delivery systems, different modalities are going to lend themselves to all sorts of different diseases, right? It is going to be specific in some way, but I think we're heading there. And I think also a great example that was in the news recently, right, is baby KJ, where essentially you're talking about a bespoke gene editing treatment that was developed very rapidly, very collaboratively, and that baby is doing great. So that is the future, right? Yeah. I love this quote. It makes me laugh, like from the movie Spaceballs, when will then be now? Soon, right? It's happening. So I agree. I think the future is bright. I think there's so much potential, that can be built upon. And, like I was sort of saying before, it's like a spark that turns into a fire. All of these little things build over time to get us where we want to go that hopefully will be better for everybody.
Do you have any advice that you'd give to the next generation of, women scientists, physician leaders, who wanna build these types of things that don't exist yet?
So, I guess my advice, thinking about my own career, is that change is hard and it can be scary, but I don't think that that should stop you. I think that if you can get over that activation energy, so to speak, you can really make a difference. And as Hilary was talking about, earlier in our conversation, to some degree, there are things that you may want to do, and then there are things that happen to you, and you have to adapt and you have to be able to sort of roll with it. And you have to be able to recognize opportunities and listen to your gut and know this is something that I should do. Like it might be risky, but I think it's going to be worth it. And have faith in yourself, you know, um, that you know what's best for you. And if even though something is hard, you've probably done something hard before. And you have to remind yourself of that in order to do the new thing. So I think that's my advice. I try to remind myself of this for myself.
Well, I liked what you said earlier too about like not being afraid to ask that question that other people might have. I think that goes along with everything you just said perfectly, as well as just that momentum and that trying to do something new. Any last words, Hilary? Let's
Be brave, work with your patients, keep your feet on the ground, but take your opportunities and dream, because actually, you can be part of making that thing happen. You really can.
Well, that's great advice. Thank you so much for joining me today. This has really been an incredible conversation. I also just want to thank our listeners out there. We really appreciate you tuning in, wishing you all a happy day. And we're so grateful to have had this time with Mrinal and Hilary to talk about gene editing and new innovations. Hear from Her Women in Healthcare Leadership podcast. Thanks again for tuning in.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again to all our listeners. It was a really wonderful conversation. We appreciate you tuning in, wishing you all a fantastic stay. This was the Hear from Her Women in Healthcare Leadership podcast. Bye, everyone.
To our listeners around the world, thanks for joining us today. Tune in as we continue our journey to amplify the voices of women leaders in healthcare. Hear from Her is brought to you by Medscape Education. Please subscribe to Hear from Her on your preferred podcast channel and follow us on LinkedIn. Until next time, remember to lift as you rise.